All right, today we're diving into one of the most profound principles of strategy out there, Law 48. Assume formlessness. This is all about the art of becoming impossible to grasp, impossible to predict, and ultimately impossible to attack. And this isn't some new idea. We're talking ancient wisdom from Sun Tzu himself. For literally thousands of years, the greatest strategists have understood that real power isn't about holding a fixed position. It's about infinite adaptability. You have to be like water. It can flow, it can crash, but you can never, ever hold it. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into the core concept of the law. Then we'll look at a classic failure, the Spartans, and a masterful success with Mao's strategy. After that, we'll see how you can apply this power yourself. And finally, we'll uncover the real, aggressive purpose behind all this fluidity. The core judgment of Law 48 is actually incredibly simple. The second you take a concrete shape, the moment you have a visible, predictable plan, you become a target. You make yourself vulnerable. So what do we really mean by formlessness here? Look, this is not about being passive or just going with the flow. It's an active state of strategic fluidity. It's about being mobile, unpredictable, and constantly adapting. It means you never ever bet on stability because everything changes. And this is where the real danger of having a fixed form comes in. Think about it. If your enemy can see your plan, they can study it. If you build a rigid system, they can poke and prod until they find the weak spot, and then they can break it. If you fall into a predictable pattern, you're basically handing them the playbook on how to beat you. A fixed form is always a target. To really see what happens when you ignore this law, let's look at one of the most famous examples in all of history, the cautionary tale of ancient Sparta. Okay, so Sparta had this massive problem. They needed to control a conquered population that outnumbered them 10 to 1. So what was their solution? They turned their entire society into a fortress, a protective shell. From the age of 7, every boy was trained for one thing and one thing only: war. They banned art, they outlawed wealth, everything was sacrificed for pure, rigid military discipline. Now, just compare that to their great rival, Athens. Sparta was landlocked, totally rigid, obsessed with keeping things exactly as they were. Athens, on the other hand, was a seafaring trade power. They were fluid, creative, and in a constant state of change. You couldn't find a more perfect clash of form versus formlessness. And here's the incredible irony in all this. Sparta's greatest strength, it became their fatal flaw. Their entire system was built on a fear of the outside world, a fear of change. But after they defeated Athens, they suddenly had to govern an empire. They were exposed to the very things their society was designed to reject: wealth, politics, new ideas. Athenian money started to pour in, and it corroded their famous discipline from the inside out. That rigid shell they had built couldn't adapt, and the once mighty Spartan nation, it just cracked and collapsed. Okay, so that's what not to do. Now let's flip the coin and look at a true masterclass in fluidity. We're going to examine Mao Zedong's strategy during the Chinese Civil War. So, after World War II, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had this huge, technically superior army. They had a clear plan: find the communists and wipe them out. But Mao just refused to play that game. He refused to take a conventional form. Instead, his forces just seemed to melt away into the countryside. They'd harass the enemy, ambush them here, retreat over there. They moved like Mercury, never forming a solid front line, never giving the nationalists a clear target to hit. A great way to understand the difference in their thinking is by looking at two different games. Chiang Kai-shek was basically playing chess. It's linear, it's aggressive, and it's all about killing your opponent's pieces directly. Mao, on the other hand, was playing the ancient game of Go. Go is nonlinear, it's fluid. The goal isn't just direct confrontation. It's about using mobility and encirclement to cause the enemy to paralyze and collapse on their own. And the result of this strategy was absolutely devastating. By being formless, the communists weren't just surrounding cities. They were surrounding the minds of the nationalist soldiers. They'd isolate whole units, cut off their supply lines, and use relentless propaganda to just destroy their morale. The superior army, completely unable to find and fight a solid enemy, grew terrified. It began to collapse from the inside out, surrendering entire cities, sometimes without even firing a shot. So, we've seen the history, the epic wins, and the epic fails. But how do you actually apply this kind of power? How do you cultivate this strategic fluidity in your own life? Well, the keys to power here are mostly psychological. First things first, you have to master your emotions. The second you get defensive or take something personally, you're revealing a weak spot, a fixed form that others can attack. Second, you have to adapt to your environment. Just like water takes the shape of its container, you can form on the surface to disarm people. And third, you have to relentlessly shed the past. The moment you become set in your ways, you become a predictable, almost comical relic, and your power just evaporates. And look, this principle goes way beyond the battlefield. Throughout history, some of the most effective rulers we've ever seen, like Queen Elizabeth I and Catherine the Great, governed with this exact formless style. They avoided rigid doctrines, they played their enemies against each other, and they adapted to the changing tides. And in the end, they proved way more resilient and powerful than many of their more rigid, predictable male counterparts. Now we get to the final and, I think, most critical piece of this whole puzzle. It is absolutely crucial to understand that being formless is not the end goal. It's a tool, a means to an end, and it has a very specific and very aggressive purpose. I mean, a quote from Al himself says it all. This phase of being elusive, of being like vapor, it isn't about avoiding a fight forever. No way. It's about choosing the perfect moment to strike, on your terms, when your enemy is confused, exhausted, and scattered. So ultimately, formlessness is a strategic weapon. You use its fluidity to make your enemies chase shadows, to scatter their own forces, to drain their energy. And then, once they are weak and disorganized, you coalesce. You take a form for one brief, decisive moment, and you attack with focused, concentrated, overwhelming power. It is the ultimate 1-2 punch. So, I'll leave you with this question. Whether it's a rigid set of habits, an outdated belief you're clinging to, or just a fear of change, what protective shell have you built for yourself that, just like Sparta's, has now become your prison?